What's up, guys? It's Willie, and today we're once again revisiting the amazing digital circus, definitely the last one prior to episode 9's official release on YouTube, which, full disclosure, obviously by the time that you're seeing this video, the full episode had already released in theaters, and you already know how the episode played out if you had watched it there. However, this video is going to be free of any sort of details relating to episode 9, so no need to worry about that. Plus, to be more open, I'm recording this on the evening of June 2nd, so there's a merit to that to be avoided of any episode 9 talk. And also, out of respect, if you have already seen episode 9, please don't drop any spoiler related stuff in the comments below, as I don't want my video to exhibit those comments that could ruin the experience for casual viewers. So please be advised with that. Anyways, we're here talking about another particular topic related to the show, and it's one that I did not really recognize until some people began to point it out on social media, that it started becoming more eye-catching to me with what it has been suggesting for the entire show. And this is regards to the amount of times Jax has just been wrong for many things. Now, to really illustrate the status quo here, this is pretty much going to be a breakdown of every aspect that he was amiss at, where obviously his mischievous act is an obvious one, to then his more blatant inaccurate read on things that easily gets contradicted, and so on. And so what I'm really doing here is going through each episode chronologically and highlighting some of the things Jax wrongly claims, which I'll also be able to follow that up with evidence that would contrast from his beliefs. And usually this would just be of a more baseline sort of subject, but I think what would make this a lot more intriguing than how it represents is the fact that the show goes on to really not back any of his statements in this whole matter. As pointed out by those viewers, every time he makes a claim or states what his beliefs is, the complete contrary ends up being the reality of it. And with this becoming more of like a cycle than a one-off case, this leads to the situation being a lot more circumstantial surrounding Jack's constant misread on things. And in a lot of cases, what contrasts to what he says does really start to heat up a bit more in the later episodes, as I'll talk about soon. So enough my spiel, we can just go on a quick run through to spot these things. So from the get-go, with Pawnee's entry to the circus, Jax just does his usual shtick of screwing with others, but we start to begin to spot some incorrect things that he tries to claim, which one of the first ones that I could recall is when he claims that pairing Gangle and Kinger together feels apt for them being the most mentally stable, which even without that humorous visual of Kinger glitching out, we obviously see them just not having some sort of compatibility with their teamwork. And then another case we have is just Jax basically BSing to the pair about Kaufmo's status, which again, might be a more of a different circumstance considering he knows the answer of Kaufmo's current state. However, this partially could be a slight elicit to his nature of denial when the reality comes dawning on him. And with his denial, we know that for a fact due to episodes that takes place afterwards. I could briefly go over episode 7 when it reveals that he was close with Kaufmo. So in many ways, this just feels like Jack seeming to struggle to comprehend with accepting the reality of losing another one of his friends. And I can also point out the part where when he makes the discovery of Kaufmo's extraction, he blatantly doesn't point out the obvious just because it seemingly is him being in denial of the horror that he had just witnessed. Anywho, all of the portrayal of this feels like the establishing trend that we're going to see with Jax just constantly in the wrong with what he thinks and says on things, and then we can carry this over to the following episodes. So to thread the needle with episode 2, there really isn't much that I can go off of because a bulk of it just comes down to his mischievous acts that we obviously know where it lands on the spectrum between right and wrong. So what I'm really going to highlight is at the end when the cast held up Kaufmo's funeral and Jax with his thought process just refusing to take part in it and just withdraw from the scene. That's something that is interesting to spot here, which it is clear in his mindset that Jax is still in practical denial of the reality with losing his only other friend, and his thought to cope with it is to just not show any signs of his emotion or what, and in simple terms basically avoiding the whole notion of showing vulnerability. And while his thought and act was definitely not rightfully justified to cope with this spot, it's definitely not going to eliminate the fact that we do see Jax expressing a somber look that does speak to the fact that he is struggling to comprehend with things, and it's just the mechanic he uses to cope with the situation, which again, not really ideal, but that's Jax for you. Speaking of, moving into episode 3, there really isn't much to talk about outside of the end part where Jack seemingly tries to insist his claim on Kinger being insane, only for Pawnee herself to dispute his comment against him, which highly suggests the irony in the spot for what Jack seems to assume otherwise. But that's that, and anyways, we can take ourselves to episode 4, which this is when we start to really heat things up, and while we literally are in a setting where the temperature rises, we are in for some very subtle foreshadowing that completely goes beyond the opposite of what Jax assumes. And to highlight what I am alluding to is that one conversation between him and Zubul where he makes the notable line that Kane wouldn't do anything malicious to them, which help me God if we had known what was going to be coming on in episode 8. Like seriously, this is now the first real grave example of something that would be contradicted in a later episode, and thus with so much of the hubris that Jax seemed to be exuding in this spot makes his portrayal of his judgments here a lot more ironic in the grand scheme of things. And this is not just because he had the wrong judgment of Kane's abilities, but also it's just like he clearly misunderstands the consequences of things and had a complete oversight with his interpretation of Kane's authority on them. And while technically it is also on Kane's own end later on that causes the cast to give him lashings that lead to him torturing them, I will still talk against Jax for even trying to have some sort of cynical assumption that Kane wouldn't do something as menacing as he does. But yeah, that was not a good way to assume things. Anyways, taking us to episode 5, which does feel like it has more of the drive to dunk on Jax's complete misread on every situation, where I mean we do have a more humorous side of things when he assumes he has a tail, but then Pomni points out otherwise, and yeah, it's just hilarious. And while his relevance is super low compared to the others I'm talking about, I still feel like it's worth pointing out just to capitalize on the continuous misjudgments that Jax exudes. But to really get to the meats and bones of it all, the bar scene when Jax just plays it off as if he's the only one having fun while everyone is seemingly expressing their opposition to it is just such a miscalculated perspective, as we see literally his sentiment turn on his head as we get to the softball end. He gets dressed in a maid costume in proxy of a poll that the rest of the cast voted for him to dress in one, and it leads to just such fun irony of him being on the other end of his earlier sentiment, but also this somewhat exemplifies his hypocrisy with his complaints on the others feeling the stagnation with the fun that he's having, only for him to express a similar-ish vibe from when others are having fun that don't cater towards his own entertainment. And this is just a continuous emphasis on Jack's misjudgment on things, and I feel like at this point it doesn't feel like it's just a constant coincidence that he just gets these things wrong. It feels like he's just framing all this as his defense mechanism because it's his only way to push back against the sobering reality. And further on top of his cruel act, his tact of judging his fellow cast members are just based on his own deluded beliefs on their suits on archetypes, which hey, I might as well talk about that in the following episode. But just to briefly summarize it, just all stems from his detachment from the other humans that further muddies his proper perceptions on their characters and thus linking to his incorrect judgments of others in this particular episode. And now jumping forward to episode 6, this is probably what I would say the peak of this subject right here, where Jax just flies off the handle with his ideas that the whole cast is based on archetypes and categorizes them in the archetypes that he feels like fits for them, and that being whole definer of their character, which while it's an interesting topic that he brought up, we just see later on how all of what he described of them completely plays out opposed to what he says. Like seeing the interaction between Ragida and Kinger embracing each other negates his claim about them, and the same thing applies for Zubul and Gangle with their moment together as well. So in further context to this, it feels like Jax's muddied views on others through pushing away them just leads to his perspective being a little muddy on the actual true characters of them, and in his eyes it feels like he views everyone in a more one-dimensional sense, thinking that only one specific personality archetype defines their character for the entirety, which is such a misconstrued notion to express here. And especially with the amount of hubris he has, believing that the reality of everyone's persona is defined by their archetype is just what makes of this residue with Jax's cruel acts of pushing away others, which is why his perspectives are so limited. And to go along with that, we obviously got to the big moment of his fight with Pomni, where I'm not just gonna go on a spiel about this, but bottom line is just constant denial of anything that he said or opened up to her in their prior bonding moments that felt very genuine, and it's just categorized by his own shtick of dehumanizing these very genuine or innocent situations in turn of leveraging them as his ways of coping. And I almost forgot to mention this, but the always line of Jax responding to Pomni's question being like, I move on and probably forget about you if she had abstracted, was just nothing but a whole bunch of bull when we literally see visuals of him looking at images of his now abstracted friends, which already contradicts his statement. And number 2, it's clear that he really does have some sort of heart for Pomni, and this is why she should be included among his friends group in a scene in a later episode. And bottom line, just bad judgment. Anyways, episode 7, where we see a very checked out Jax just getting confronted by Zubul, and when they give him a little advice to try and open up about problems that are just lingering around his head, he bluntly denies exhibiting any problems, which is just pure BS there, as we see literally in the last few episodes that he's had his own issues with coping and stuff, and is also why he's now beginning to conceive panic attacks. And something that I wasn't emphasized a lot on his denial is that while they are obviously mapped out as him being in the wrong, I also feel like it's honestly a scale that he's doing it in his own way of masking off his biggest issue, which is revealing his own vulnerability. And this is what we saw in literally the last episode when Jax had to push away Pomni after seeing how close he got with her. So it's like he values off this mold of sustaining this mask, and therefore any semblance of what the reality is of him is instantly met with disputes from his own self. Now this one I don't think really acts as a strong example to this topic, but I wanted to point it out because it feels like there's a lot more subtle meaning to it that still is up in the air, as when he is asked if there's anyone awaiting for him in the real life world, he just hesitantly says yes, as if he is actually being truthful here, which of course in most cases when people act that way, it's clear that they're not being 100% genuine with their answer, and Jax is another great example of that, where should I take his answer to face value? Absolutely not. And even he himself is clearly having resistance, which shows there's more to that. Anyways, we can get ourselves to the latest episode where Jax is just so out of it and seems to want to walk off and isolate himself. But Zuul stops him with some very heartwarming words, and despite Zuul trying to pull Jax in within the group, he just brushes them off and makes his claim that he is not capable of abstracting, which John Cena would say, are you sure about that?
Are you sure about that?
Because literally in the last episode, he nearly abstracted had Pomni not rang his doorbell on time. Like, even in that sense, that's more of a past tense sort of way to evidently dispute his claim right there. And that's another pretty interesting argument, how much he just is in constant full denial of things that were just so evident. And after that, pretty much the rest of the story up until this point don't really have relevance to the topic, so I think that's pretty much where I'm gonna wrap things up here. We've accumulated quite a collective amount of material out of how much wrongs and misjudgments Jax has been displaying throughout the series, and it's clear that the show is actively doing so because it might be paying dividends to something that happens at the end, which God knows what's gonna happen. But just getting to the bottom of the barrel here is just such an outstanding quantity of things to list out how Jax would just completely make incorrect claims and inaccurate ideas of things and others, which have been blatantly portrayed to counter any of his arguments. And overall, to iterate, I think all of this just has to be some of the remnants of his mischievous persona, which includes a lot of deceit, denial, and poor reads due to a lot of self-isolation, detachment, and just the biggest glean of masking off his fear of showing vulnerability. And something like this that could have just been mentioned in brief is worth expanding on when you really see how its spectacle is blending intriguingly with the story, especially on Jack's side of things. Now, before I cut the video, I might as well make this one last brief appreciation before the final episode comes out, but this show has really been such a great hit, even peaked to, I would say, above the height of Mount Kilimanjaro. And truthfully, for someone like me who isn't even like a long year fan, as I've only really ingratiated myself in the fandom for like 9 months, it still felt like this captivating experience with so much of an interesting motif and spectacular gravity that makes the show on such a strong spectacle for me. And with how much the show has really induced my anxiety has led to the fun of it, with just how much I've enjoyed myself watching and covering this show on my social medias. And even after the series end, I still plan on talking about it more on other unique topics down the road, but I cannot thank Glitch and Gooseworks for this masterpiece of an anime product. And however the finale will conclude, I hope they get at least the best ending they could to build to this very outstanding story that has been building up to something huge. We'll just see from there when the episode releases. So finally, in the meantime, for myself, I would just be sitting right here blasting to some good old Demi Lovato songs, because I need some comfort-inducing stuff that will ease the anxiety of my heart coming into episode 9. But letting me know what you guys think in the comments below, and like my other videos, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more down the road. This is it. I'm gonna sign off here. I appreciate you all tuning in, and we'll see you all in the next video.